Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are joining from around the world. So thank you all so much for taking the time to join our webinar today on EUDR and the incoming rules and regulations around deforestation. My name is Cameron Scadding. I'm the founder and managing director of Source Certain. So I'll be hosting the webinar today. What we're going to do is we're going to, I'll do a presentation, and then I'm going to have two of the guests do a presentation, and then at the back end of the webinar, we're going to open it up to Q&A. Before I get started, I just want to note that Source Certain acknowledges the traditional custodians throughout Australia and their continuing connection to the land, waters and community. We pay our respects to all members of the Aboriginal communities and their cultures, and to elders past and present and emerging. So we keep that general because it depends on where, obviously, in Australia or potentially the world you are joining from. So what I'd like to do first is, like I said, the sequence today is we're going to have some presentations and then we're going to go into a Q&A session. But before I get started, just to keep sort of the admin, and also it gives a little bit of extra time for people to join, I just want to introduce our two speakers for today. So we've had an apology from Phil Guillery because of another commitment, and so he has kindly shared his content, and so Charlie will do that on his behalf. But firstly, let me just do a couple of introductions. So I have Charlie Watkinson, who's in the room with me. So I'm going to get him to stick his head around and say hello. Welcome, Charlie. Charlie has a decade of experience in geographic origin authentication and product traceability. Charlie's passionate about helping businesses reduce the risk of scandals and ensure ethical sourcing practices. So throughout his career, Charlie has focused his research on developing cutting-edge technologies to verify the origin and authenticity of agriculture and natural products, with a particular emphasis on reducing deforestation, which is very topical for today, and promoting sustainable sourcing. His strong background in geographic information systems and remote sensing and data analysis equips him to tackle complex challenges in ensuring transparent and accountable supply chains. I've also got, and I'll get Matt to come onto camera as well, I've also got Matt de Jongh. Matt has, who is the Sustainability Manager for Responsible Wood. So Matt will be talking about sustainable forest management and deforestation. So as an operational forester for almost 11 years, Matt managed both native and plantation forests with Forestry Corporation of New South Wales in various locations through regional New South Wales. Also spending time on secondment to the New South Wales Natural Resources Commission to assist with the management of the statewide New South Wales Forest Monitoring and Improvement Program. In forestry policy, Matt has worked for both the Australian Government and the Australian Forest Products Association. Matt is passionate about promoting and communicating sustainable forest management and advocating for environmental, social and economic benefits associated with forestry. So firstly, thank you very much, gents, for joining. As you can see, just to all the people that have joined us, we've sort of covered what we're going to do in terms of the rules and what is heading our way in terms of industry, but also as those service providers around the ecosystem. The other thing we're going to do is dive into some of the practical sustainability aspects with respect to forestry, and then we're going to also show you some of the different use cases that we've seen. So up first, I'm going to do an introductory presentation, which just sort of sets the scene. Bear with me as I go and share the screen. Okay, fantastic. I've got a thumbs up. Thank you to Amy, who is sitting opposite here, making sure all the technical's working. Okay, so what I'm going to do is a couple of things. I'm going to sort of lay the foundation for the upcoming speakers, but I'm also going to provide some of my, I guess, experience in working in the broad supply chain transparency space and some of the big trends that we're seeing. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to sort of talk about some of the big trends, but I'm also going to show you at the back end a specific case study which we've worked on, which sort of shows, hey, how a specific type of technology can help with a particular problem. As I said, introduction that I've provided. So I'll go first, and then Charlie's going to sort of expand off that base around EUDR, talking specifically around traceability and deforestation. Charlie's also going to do some specific content from Phil around some of the data that's needed to support compliance with EUDR, and then we'll round out with back to the forest with Matt specifically. So just a little bit about my background. So I'm a forensic science and forensic investigator by training. I've spent certainly the bulk of my forensic career in the application of technology to crime that has often been executed within supply chain. I'm very, very passionate about primary production and primary producers specifically. And one of the reasons why we're doing these types of webinars is I see immense opportunity for primary producers to get more value out of the amazing products they produce as markets become more and more aware about not just where their products have come from, but also how they've been made. So I always like to sort of ground truth these conversations with, why EUDR, like what is the whole purpose? And notice to the people, the panelists, Charlie and Matt, I definitely intend to round back to this question. Which is, what is the purpose of a regulatory intervention as extensive as what EUDR is, and what are we actually trying to achieve with it? And I think it's worth distilling down the challenge that, consumption or purchasing of products often a world away can have an impact on not just, the people inside the supply chain, but also the environment. And so when you kind of get to the bottom of what EUDR is looking to do, it's primarily to get the market or sort of the demand side to a place where it is not knowingly funding deforestation. And so if consumers, or more importantly, in this case, the brands that build trust with these consumers, care about these issues, of which I think it's pretty difficult to not get on board with trying to stop tearing down rainforests. How do we make sure that the supply chains that carry these products unknowingly do it, so unknowingly funding this activity? And so, you can see the slide here is kind of turning the lights on. The first step ultimately is, whereabouts are these products coming from, and you can't get there without illuminating the various actors, but also obviously the behaviours that are afoot inside these supply chains. So what are the big drivers? I think anybody that works in the supply chain space will know that consumers are definitely more aware of not just the where or wanting to know the where, but also they're starting to ask more questions about the how. I don't think they necessarily know exactly what they want, but they certainly have a pretty good idea when they see something they don't like, and they're willing to act on that. Jumping to the other end of this, there's this huge tailwind around ESG, which, we've got this massive number there of $50.3 trillion of assets under management, and there's these really big questions that emerge as to whether that's actually having the impact that it's meant to, or most of these products, certainly investment products, not actually going the full distance and actually achieving the impact they're promising, and which is leading to obviously a whole heap of different regulatory intervention around greenwashing in particular, including here in Australia. And I guess the one for today, which is obviously the purpose of the webinar, is the regulatory compliance. So it's clear from the pace of change that regulators around the world are acting, and they're acting now, and probably one of the most extensive of those interventions is the new EU Deforestation Regulation. So let's just sort of jump back up sort of 30,000 feet and say, okay, what does a supply chain look like? Now, we're going to focus a lot on timber today, so I've deliberately sort of placed a relatively simple coffee supply chain into the presentation, not because I don't want us to talk about timber, but I kind of want to relate to it as a consumer. And, you've got two ends of a supply chain ultimately, and this is obviously simplified, but you've got where it's produced and then obviously the point of sale, or maybe where it's consumed. And effectively what we've got with regulatory intervention is more like a significant focus on the consumption end, which is the okay, where has this come from and how has it been grown? And which raises these really big questions around, well, how does that information get from one end to the other? And so for those that work in this space, how do you mediate that transparency? Is the information that comes through accurate? Can you trust it? What does the information even tell us? And can we verify it at all? Like, is it possible to even get to the bottom of whether that's true or not? So then you've got, like I said, you've got this sort of consumer facing piece, which, makes a whole heap of different claims often relating to not just where, but also sometimes the stories or the how. And there's this ongoing need now to think, okay, what's the evidence base that sits underneath these claims? Most of these claims were already in the marketplace, but can you rely on them? Are they actually doing what they're meant to be doing? Certainly when you make ethical sourcing claims, is there a base underneath that, which again results in this, challenging question of, okay, we've made a commitment around, the type of products we want, the type of sourcing that we want to do. How do we get the data needed to support the information needed, which then can support a due diligence process or the evidence that sits underneath these important promises that are being made? So let's just sort of think about it. And again, kind of keep it simple. So you've got sort of coffee beans there, and what can you tell from the coffee beans? You've obviously got, from this particular point, we've got very, very specific claims. Maybe there's certifications, maybe there's a specific promise being made, maybe even provenance to a particular location, depending on. It's certainly not uncommon to wander through this part of a supermarket and see just about every country that produces in some sort of promise on a label somewhere. Obviously the beans, can you tell from the beans? There's obviously nothing there. But then there's also the reality that sits behind these supply chains, which is we end up with these crisp, clear claims at one end, but there is just an absolute reality of obviously what is happening kind of back towards the supply chain. And if you imagine, this actually is sitting not too far from where obviously we're trying to stop, deforestation. How does the market a world away, get to the bottom of this and actually stop the purchase kind of from the demand side, actually going all the way back and funding maybe the clearing of a rainforest? So it's not obvious. It's obviously quite obvious, and it doesn't take much to get to the fact that there's lots and lots of risk here, and that risk has been now elevated sort of beyond the broad social license one to now an actual regulatory compliance one. So we'll talk a lot about EUDR. So I just want to summarise, what is the purpose of EUDR? Like I said, the purpose is to try and stop us, for the purposes of ag and food products, tearing down rainforests. So how is the law setting about doing that? It's identifying the commodities, firstly, that present the most risk to rainforest or the cause of deforestation. So you've got palm oil, rubber, soy, cattle, coffee, cocoa, and timber. It's not just those, though. It's the derived products thereof. And at the real kind of bottom of it, there's what the regulatory framework now does is it says you need to know where these have come from. And you need to be confident with evidence that they are deforestation free. And so if you think about this from a regulatory intervention perspective in the context of food, we've spent sort of the last 3 to 4 decades focused on knowing not just who we bought it from, but maybe who we sold it to from a one-up, one-back traceability perspective. What the EUDR says is none of that matters, right? You might choose to do it that way or execute it that way, but if you're at one end of the supply chain, the demand or the selling into Europe end, you need to know where it's actually been sourced from and how you go about doing that. It's not particularly prescriptive from a regulation point of view, but you need to be able to do it and you need to be confident of it, and it needs to be evidence-based, and hence the very strong focus on due diligence. It then goes on to, obviously, the regulation has an outline of the enforcement. What I think is interesting about that is it's setting targets for member countries, which means theoretically, at least, obviously we're still getting started, but There shouldn't be islands of enforcement in the EU, so that there won't be an opportunity for there to be certain products dumped into certain countries. Like I said, that obviously needs to be executed on, and then some pretty significant fines around this 4% of company EU turnover. So I think when you sort of step kind of back from what's happened here, is this is a regulator that builds on some existing regulation around timber, but has gone a long way to say enough's enough. If we want to sell these products, we need to know where they've come from. So what's the pathway look to get to compliance? And so we obviously talk to clients a lot about this, and when you've got new regulation as significant as what EUDR is, I think it's important to sort of recognise that there isn't a single solution, right? There's going to be lots and lots of different things which will be tailored to specific supply chains, which are often commodity and obviously source focused. And where we are now is we're in the squiggly bit of this line. And what we've got to do is over the next sort of 10 months is straighten this line out and actually find ways to put the various bits of the solution together, which are always going to be risk based. And so the higher risk items obviously requiring more effort. So there is a high level of focus around the concept of due diligence in the regulation. There's not just a need to do it, there's a need to have a system by which it's done. There's also a whole range of different disclosure requirements, and certainly when you've got corrective actions, the disclosure thereof. What we're sort of saying is it's important to get started. We obviously advocate with our vested interest, of course, that scientific testing is a critical part of it. Because we are able to verify actual origin, but it all needs to be put together to provide the required amount of information to satisfy or support compliance. Like I said, there is no silver bullet here. So just sort of starting to visualize it, what does the law require? Who is checking? What solutions are available and how are they checking? Obviously, with the goal being some form of compliance. So if you start to unpack this, I'm not going to go into detail. We're going to share the deck afterwards. So, but I just want to sort of show that, there are lots of different parts to this, and there is a level of requirement, which is supply chain by supply chain. What is going to be needed to satisfy the requirements? What is the requirement? There's a need to disclose the location. Probably the most significant piece of this is that the product is going to be of a known origin. And that's the foundational piece, because obviously the known origin or location, which the information Charlie will share around the geospatial data and some of those requirements, obviously that ties the product promise all the way back to the very specific problem, which is deforestation, which obviously is where the forests are. Who's checking? Each of the countries will have a competent authority, or there'll be maybe multiple depending on. And so there are going to be people in each of these member countries doing stuff. And like I said, there is some outline of the requirement of these member countries to actually be doing these checks. What solutions are available. Charlie and Matt will talk a bit about this, but just sort of throwing some ideas that there's legal solutions, in terms of how do you manage the regulation? What are the requirements? Where are the nuances? The satellite monitoring, traceability platforms, or more visibility, and of course scientific solutions. And probably, we always kind of come back, how are the regulators going to check? Well, there's going to obviously be evaluation of the due diligence information. There is a need to comply with the actual requirements around disclosure. But then they're also going to, and they've put into law that they are going to be using scientific analysis to check where products have come from. So, one of the things that we're working really hard on here is knowing that certainly our science, or the science we've developed, which I'll talk a little bit about more now, is going to be used on the checking. How do we package that up and ensure that it's also part of the solution, so that the first time maybe a stakeholder learns of an issue isn't when the regulators sort of found a sample and checked it. So which bit do we do? And this is sort of the pitch part from me, from a source certain perspective, is the bit we do is the verification of source. It's that has that product come from that particular location. And so we use a profiling method which determines a fingerprint which is unique to the exact location from which the product or the commodity has come from. We'll drop a link to the animation that describes the technology into the chat, and we'll also share that when we circulate that more widely. For me, wrapping up, I just wanted to step through a case study. So this is a timber case study, which again is designed to lay a foundation for Charlie and Matt, who will follow. So this is a specific one around teak coming out of the Solomon Islands, and sort of generally or at a macro level, you know, more of this Solomon Island teak being available than there could possibly have been, but also making sure that if it is Solomon Island teak, you know, is it actually from the sustainable forestry unit that it's actually meant to have come from? And anybody from it, or certainly any Australian, will know that we are very tuned in, or at least connected to the Solomon Islands. And so there's a high level of interest here, with the general comment too that obviously lots of timber goes via China to be produced into their final product. So what you've got here is an island, effectively. It's not particularly big, and part of this island has a sustainably managed teak forestry unit. So this is a legal source or an approved source for teak. What we needed to be able to do, though, given the fact that either the adjoining islands or some parts of the island are not legal, it was really important that we were able to, from a timber sample in the market, actually identify exactly where this particular teak had come from. And so the task we were set is can you tell me from where on this 30-kilometre across island, I'm getting a thumbs up from Charlie, a 30-kilometre across island, which is not very big, can you tell me exactly where that's actually come from, or verify exactly where that's come from? And so the task we were set was that. So what we did is we executed a sampling program with some help from FSC in particular, that basically provided us with some samples that enabled us to use our technology to determine the fingerprint that sits underneath all of those dots that you can see on that map there, which have been sort of separated now into the 6 regions. So what we're able to do is successfully break the island up into 6 kind of broad areas. Just stepping you through here, just showing you that you're able to actually do that. And then what we've also shown you there is on the right is here are some of the metals that we are determining in those samples. So this is real samples and the differences we're seeing from the different islands. So the outcome of this is, from a Solomon Island teak perspective, we can obviously verify that it's Solomon Island, but we can also verify which part of Kolombangara Island the teak came from. Why is it so important? It's so important because, you know, you're talking about lines on a map now. It's not just about what country has a piece of wood come from or what country a particular commodities come from. It's which specific location it has come from. And so hence the kind of focus that we've placed on getting our technology certainly to a place where we're able to deliver that. Okay, I'm going to now hand over. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand over now to Charlie, who is going to do a couple of things, the deforestation piece and then some database stuff.
Yep. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction and for having me today. And I hope to be able to get through this as quick as possible so we can get through to the questions. So hi there, nice to see you all. I'm Charlie Watkinson. I've come out of Europe's largest stable isotope laboratory, worked there for basically the past decade. I've not just dealt with things like timber, I've worked with other materials such as pork, eggs, beef. I actually worked with a very big retailer back in the UK, and anything where there was a geographic origin claim or a on-pack claim that was related to the way that something was produced, we eventually found ways to be able to verify that for them through testing programs. I got tuned into wood in about 2015, and I've been interested in ways to build pre-competitive wood collections, such as being part of the World Forest ID project. And a bit about my professional experience with respect to wood. I've worked with both operators and competent authorities for trade authentication, product authentication under the European Union Timber Regulation, the UK version of the same law, the United States Lacey Act, and now I'm very pleased to be working on things related to the Illegal Logging Prohibition Act in Australia. So I don't like the analogy of things like pillars because I like more simple ones. I want to pick 3 themes to focus on with respect to the EUDR. Here we have a chair. We have a leg of the chair, which means what we need to be producing is things that are traceable. We need to be producing things that are deforestation free, and we need to be producing things that are verifiable. If we don't have any one of those 3 things, we won't be able to sit on that chair without falling over. I also think that the timber industry is quite better set up to deal with the EUDR, mostly because we've had the EUTR since, what was it, thereabouts 2013. And so we're kind of used to the regulatory landscape, the interaction with the competent authorities, the letters of request that we received from those guys about what due diligence that we're doing. This is not necessarily as true as it is for other commodities such as cocoa and soya, where I'm sure that there's going to be a bit of a learning curve. But I would like for audience members today to think about maybe where they sit within the EUDR steeplechase. Are you at the hurdle of having things traceable? Are you over the hurdle of having things deforestation free? Are things verifiable to you? Let's have a little discussion about what we mean with respect to those terms that I'm using. So maybe we could think that we could solve everything if we could say everything was traceable. What's important is, what does the word traceability mean? It really just means that we have a product or a material and we can share information about it and where it's been along its supply chain. So if you want that in our extremely simplified supply chain here, we've got a piece of wood that goes through our amorphous factory and that ends up in our 1970s kitsch furniture store. So as long as we know that that piece of wood has come from there, we could say it's traceable. The issue with traceability is that it is information. Product or material can be traceable, but you could have incomplete traceability records, and that be part of your traceability scheme. Some of those records can be incorrect, and there are prominent examples, particularly within the British food industry, of where we've had traceable material and the information about it was completely incorrect, such as horse meat substituted as beef. We're going to touch a little on what we mean about with respect to deforestation. I'm sure that Matt has more information about this. The best information that you're going to get about what deforestation means with respect to the EUDR is the wording of it. If you have a look at Article 2, this sets out all of the information about what the specific definitions are. So we've really latched onto this term deforestation, and people may equate that incorrectly with illegal logging. Specifically, what it means is conversion of primary forest to agricultural use. Forest degradation might mean changes to the forest itself to becoming things like a plantation. So if we want to be able to eliminate that within our supply chains, our organizations need to be able to adopt zero deforestation policy. There is an excellent peer-reviewed paper produced by ETH Zurich, by Grabs et al. This outlines ways to being able to achieve this. I'm not going to delve heavily into the details, but the large structure of this is going to be something like that within an operational team, within an importer or an operator, maybe a suggestion would be to form an EUDR team to perform risk assessments, to be able to deal with the information that needs to be handled with that, and then have that policy go through into contracts that we have with our suppliers, and then have that go right that way down to the primary production itself. But you can't have zero deforestation policy without first having the traceability and knowing your suppliers. You can't really do that unless all of your suppliers are set up with polygon boundaries, and you can't guarantee that something is deforestation free or free of forest degradation without some effective means of inventory monitoring, such as remote sensing from our satellites or perhaps actually using drones. There are examples of where that's going to provide much better resolution than you would be able to get from satellites. And you'll even find that there are differences between the different deforestation monitoring platforms that exist. Here is an example of a supply chain problem that I get quite regularly cross commodity. Imagine it's you on the right. You probably deal with a factory or a supplier. This supplier operates in country A, and in reality, most of what they supply you might be from country A. But in reality, sometimes they buy from country B or country C. You could change the word country to supplier or forest or something that isn't necessarily approved. The question I'd be asking today of anyone who's attending is, do you really know all of your suppliers? Because that's more or less what EUDR is pushing you to know. And finally, we need to discuss about making it verifiable. I don't think the EUDR leaves any room for the concept of trusted suppliers. And there are some basic sniff tests that we can put over things to say, will we be at the point of achieving verifiable deforestation claims? For example, if your supplier is supplying you with 1,000 meters cubed of material they can only supply, but they are supplying you with 5,000, they're only realistically able to do that because of a magic tunnel. We need to make sure that the transactions that exist are verifiable as well. The ESG claims that they're making are supported by underlying data. And the bit where we're able to help out with, which is the product authentication part of it, part of this will come from working with third-party certifications, such as seeing that your supplier is segregating materials by source. But another way of being able to have eyes on that supply chain is by saying, okay, do our test results, for example, support that the Croatian oak that our supplier is making into oak flooring is actually oak and that it's actually from Croatia, for instance. Now, I want to emphasize that there is nothing prescriptive within the EUDR that says that you have to do things like testing to be able to achieve compliance. What I would say in response is, would you drive down a road with speed cameras if you didn't know what speed you were driving? Because that's the reality, is that the competent authorities will be performing checks on operators importing goods into the European Union. And if you wouldn't do that, then perhaps testing should be part of your risk mitigation and due diligence strategy. So there are multiple different tests that work on wood, and they work on the different types of wood product. Solid wood is generally easiest to work with for everybody. There are lots of tests that I've listed here that you could apply over it. Engineered wood gets to be more specific, and you have problems to do with other things being included within the material itself. And then you get on to very commingled products such as MDF, HDF, fiberboard, or paper, where realistically you can only do things by fiber analysis. I do a lot of wood anatomy, so I can look at wood under the microscope and be able to verify what kind of genus something is. As I say, there's products that this works well with. Fiberboard, you need to basically take this, unmake it like you were making paper, basically break it down into the fibers it was made from. And then what I would do with that is, if you've got a spec sheet from your supplier saying, this material is supposed to be 90% pine, 10% eucalyptus. The test result says you've got 10% rubber wood in there. How did that rubber wood get in there? It's probably not by accident at that sort of level. So what conversation would you need to have with your supplier if you found that out? Other tests exist to be able to verify origins, such as stable isotopes, which is what I've worked on for the last 10 years. You can get within a country within stable isotopes in some cases where you get extreme results. That can be helpful. That can be helpful when the issues you have are over very large distances. But if you want to get down to fine grain, then there are other ways of being able to approach that. You might also want to be able to look at lots of different types of wood in a product. This is a piece of plywood. Here we've taken that piece of plywood, we've looked at the chemical composition of the layers, and from what we can see here, we could say several things about it, that there are distinctions between the elemental profiles in them. Those are almost certainly because of different taxonomic and geographic sources within within the product itself. So it's made a different species, and those species are coming from different places. And we can do tests on products like this with very little preparation on layers that are incredibly small, which is where we need to be going if we've got very complex wood. So I'm not going to take a pause there. What I'm going to say is, unfortunately, Phil Guillery couldn't attend today because another commitment came up. But if you want to be in touch with Phil Guillery following seeing this, we'll be very happy to put you in touch. So Phil, along with some people from Preferred by Nature, had been working on the geospatial data sharing protocol. It was a very necessary thing to set up to be able to hit compliance for the EUDR. If we're going to say that people need to be producing polygons for where wood is coming from, we need a way of being able to efficiently communicate that information. If you're supplying goods that are potentially from 850,000 different smallholders, we could be transferring terabytes worth of data every time we want to import goods into the EU. So that was the real need for this. Preferred by Nature got funding from the FAO to be able to do this. It was EUDR agnostic, but it was very much with an EUDR theme that we needed to be able to do this with. So as I say, we needed a way of being able to have a standard around communicating that information so that we can communicate it between supply chain participants, and so that we could submit that to competent authorities if there is a request or requirement to be able to show that the due diligence has been adequately performed. A good example of this would be, Phil gave me an example with someone from Lewis Dreyfus Company saying that they receive spatial data from their suppliers in potentially up to 100 different forms. So we need a means to being able to standardize that so we have a single system. This document here from Preferred by Nature, the Geospatial Data Sharing Protocol, covers this. And if you look this up on Preferred by Nature's website, it's a really good resource about how you would be able to lodge where goods are coming from in a language that's common between suppliers. So it's really all that's covered by this document is a set of rules, how that data should be structured and formatted so that we can communicate with other people. And so we can go from people who are not using the protocol to people who are adopting it as a standard. And likely with time, this will become its own standard by FAO. The secret sauce behind how this is working is that it's never going to be efficient in terms of data sharing to communicate these polygons themselves actually as shape files, because we will be exchanging gigabytes or terabytes of information. Instead, what's recommended is using a spatial indexing system, which is very similar to the way that Google works or Uber is able to say where your taxi is or where your taxi can go, to be able to communicate that information. It's much lighter and easier to be able to adopt. It also specifies things to do with the minimum metadata requirements, such as species, where your harvest started, where it ended. I think a really big important part of this is there's a compromise between the requirement for anonymity for numerous reasons, personal data protection, also protecting people's position within the supply chain, but also having accurate information about where a good is coming from. So the way that that is being resolved within this protocol is removing undesired metadata, for example, anonymizing farmers or previous trading entities. And if you follow this, essentially, you will get to a point where you can lodge the right data for when you're importing goods to the EU and have that requirement that says that we've only sourced goods from areas that we can say are free of forest degradation and deforestation. Thank you very much. I'll pass over.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I'm going to stop sharing. Over to you, Matt. I'll get you to share your screen. Just a reminder to everybody to drop your questions in as they come up. You good, Matt?
Hopefully you can see my screen there.
Yep, gotcha.
Okay,
Thanks,
great.
Matt.
No worries. Okay. Thanks, Cam. Thanks, Charlie. So I'm just going to talk about forest certification and and chain of custody certification. So just give a bit of an overview about responsible wood. So who Responsible Wood is. So Responsible Wood is a standards development organisation. We're actually licensed by Standards Australia to write and develop standards. But Responsible Wood is also endorsed by PEFC. So PEFC, which is a program for the endorsement of forest certification, is the world's largest global forest certification scheme. So Responsible Wood has about 20 million hectares of forest certified in Australia and New Zealand. We also have about 350 chain of custody certificate holders in Australia and New Zealand as well. So a standards development organisation, and what Responsible Wood basically does is we write and develop standards, as I said, licensed by Standards Australia. We have two standards, one for sustainable forest management and one for chain of custody certification. So I just like to put this image up because there's been a lot of talk about deforestation, and Cam in particular talked about consumer needs. So essentially, if a consumer buys a product that's either Responsible Wood or PEFC certified, they can be assured that it's come from a forest that has not resulted in deforestation. So the forest absolutely remains a forest. So forest and wood-based products are removed from the forest, but the forest absolutely remains a forest. So as of December last year, so December 2023, Responsible Wood, we developed a statement on deforestation and forest degradation. So you can probably see at the bottom of that slide there, there's actually a link to that statement on our webpage. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that because, unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there about certified sustainable forest management being linked to deforestation. So certification was actually established in the 1990s as a means to halt deforestation. So if consumers buy products that are certified, as long as they've got the Responsible Wood or the PEFC logo on them, they can be assured that's come from a forest that remains a forest. So deforestation is where there's a land use change, so where the forest is cleared for some other land use, as per that image there, for urban expansion or infrastructure development. So I mentioned a bit earlier about the two standards. So essentially, Responsible Wood writes two standards. So one for sustainable forest management and one for chain of custody certification. So those images there, up at the top four images there, you can clearly see that those have a forest in the background. So all of those forests are Responsible Wood certified forests. So all of those forests have had forest and wood-based products removed from them, and they've all, as you can see quite clearly, that they are still forests. So the trees have regrown, they've regenerated, they've been replanted, but absolutely the forest remains a forest. And then we have chain of custody certification. So what chain of custody certification is? Chain of custody certification is for manufacturers, processors, wholesalers and retailers. So what chain of custody certification does, and both Cam and Charlie have talked quite a bit about it, it basically follows the forest and wood-based product all the way from the forest, all the way through that processing, manufacturing, wholesaling and retailing process, so all the way through the supply chain and all the way to the end consumer. So I've just put in there, you might see an image, I'm sure you're probably familiar with it. I'm not trying to give Woolies too much of a plug here, but the Woolies paper bag, for example. So the Woolies paper bag has the PEFC label on it. And as I said, Responsible Wood is PEFC for Australia and New Zealand. Also solvent toilet paper or tissue is also PEFC Responsible Wood certified as well. So just to give you some global context, I talked about PEFC. So PEFC, which is the program for the endorsement of forest certification. So PEFC was actually established in about 1999. It was initially known as the Program for European Forest Certification. So it was established in Europe initially back in 1999. But since it's become the world's largest global forest certification scheme with almost 300 million hectares of forest certified. So understandably, they had to change the name change the E in it to endorsement instead of Europe. So as you can see there, about 50 countries are endorsed under the PEFC scheme internationally. So as I said earlier, Responsible Wood is PEFC for Australia and New Zealand. So all of those countries that are coloured in the dark green colour there, that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire country is PEFC or PEFC endorsed. It just means that those countries have nationally endorsed systems under PEFC. So just for example, North America has an organisation called SFI, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. So SFI has about 160 million hectares forest certified just in North America. So that's just over half of the total certified area by our PFC globally. And as I said before, responsible wood, we have about 20 million hectares of forest certified in Australia and also New Zealand. I just wanted to put this little image up just to show. So there's essentially two large global forest certification schemes, and I think both Cam, well, certainly Charlie did in his last presentation. He mentioned the other scheme, FSC. So FSC was actually established. The Forest Stewardship Council was essentially established in about 1995, and as I said, PFC was established in about 1999. So fundamentally, both schemes are very similar. As I said before, forest certification was established as a means to halt deforestation. But as you can see, as far as global area, the size of the forest area that's certified, PFC is almost double the size of FSC as far as the global area certified. Just interestingly, in that little graphic there, you might see that hopefully comes up as orange on your graphic there, that little orange shaded area. So that's the area that's dual certified. So there's a lot of forest. So there's about 86 million hectares of forest that's actually dual certified. So a lot of forest managers and growers, for example, like to have both PFC and FSC certification. So in Australia, there's a lot of forests in Australia and New Zealand. Sorry, there's a lot of forests that are actually dual certified to both responsible wood and FSC. And similarly with companies that are chain of custody certificate holders, a lot of companies are also dual certified to both PFC and FSC. So forest certification and chain of custody certification, it's more than just a double check. We've heard a little bit about legality and regulations and legislation, but forest and chain of custody certification is actually underpinned by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So the PFC scheme is underpinned by the UN SDGs. So essentially organisations, forest growers and forest managers, for example, not only need to ensure that the trees regrow and regenerate, but also that their workers are treated fairly, ensure that organisations minimise their carbon footprint, and that's all along the supply chain. So that's for sustainable forest management and also for chain of custody certification. And there's also a whole chapter within the standard that deals with what's called the Montreal Process Criteria and Indicators. So the Montreal Process Criteria and Indicators, that's why I've got that image up there of the Australia State of the Forest report that's produced every 5 years by the Australian government. So that's the international reporting mechanism against the economic, social and environmental aspects of forest management, whether it be production forest or a conservation forest. So this image here, this is the PFC model. This is how certification is basically implemented. So PFC, and as I said before, responsible wood is PFC for Australia and New Zealand. So at responsible wood, we write and develop the two standards, the Sustainable Forest Management Standard and the Chain of Custody Standard. But we are completely independent of the certification process. So certification is conducted by independent third-party auditors or certification bodies. And those auditors are also accredited by a national accreditation scheme. So in Australia, we have JASANS, which is the Joint Australia and New Zealand accreditation body. And they're also accredited by the International Accreditation Forum. So that's a PFC certification body, and that takes place across those 50-odd national governing bodies that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So just very important to emphasise that responsible wood is completely independent of that certification and that audit process. So I've covered a lot of these things before. So essentially, if you purchase products that are certified, has a responsible wood or the PFC label on it, you can be assured it's come from a forest. As I said, fundamentally that the forest remains a forest, the trees regrow, regenerate, but also importantly, biodiversity and cultural heritage values, for example, are also need to be enhanced and protected as well. And there's been quite a bit of talk about it with both Cam and Charlie talking about legal compliance, and also through chain of custody ensuring that there's assurance of origin and ensuring that the forest wood-based product, whether it be a piece of timber or toilet paper or tissue or whatever, has come from a sustainably managed forest. And we do work very closely with the Australian government, so particularly the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. And there's been a bit of talk by both Cam and Charlie about the Illegal Logging Prohibition Act. So we actually work very closely with the Australian government, particularly under their timber legality framework, which we're probably going to talk a little bit about in a minute. And yeah, there's a couple of photos. I had the pleasure of being over at the Source Certain premises late last year. I think it might have been November, October last year. So I was particularly able to get a couple of photos there, which was very nice of Cam and Charlie to allow me to do that. So we're absolutely working with Source Certain, also other organisations as well on other means of verifying source of origin. So obviously, DNA tracking and other sort of molecular and isotopic composition methods. So as I said earlier, forestry, particularly in Australia, it's very much a contested space, and there's a lot of misinformation out there about forestry, and particularly, as I said before, some organisations try and portray forestry, particularly certified forestry, being linked with deforestation. As I said, that's couldn't be further from the truth. It's absolutely not the case. So we actually held a round of field trips in 2023, and we're looking to hold another 3. We're actually looking to hold one in WA as well this year, probably later in the year. So encourage those who are on this call if they'd like to come out and have a look. And it's a full immersive process where we take attendees out and show them the whole sustainable forest management and then the whole supply chain. So take them to a processing and a manufacturing facility as well. And just my final slide, this just sort of covers off on the key points that I've talked about. So obviously, very importantly, I can't stress it enough. I've probably said it about 6 times. If you purchase products that have got the PFC or the Responsible Wood label on it, you can be assured it's come from a forest that remains a forest. And there's also obviously carbon and climate mitigation benefits from using forest and wood-based products. So as we all know, wood comes from trees. Trees absorb and sequester carbon. And a little known fact is that about half the dry weight of wood is actually what we call biogenic carbon. So, for example, if you've got a 100 kilogram wooden dining table at home, about 50 kilos of that is actually biogenic carbon. So for the entire life of that forest and wood-based product, it actually contains biogenic carbon. And it's also been scientifically proven, some really good research out there. I only had 15 minutes, so I couldn't go into all the detail, but it's been scientifically proven that a sustainably managed forest actually has far greater climate mitigation benefits than an unmanaged forest, and that's actually backed up by the International Panel on Climate Change. So young regrowth trees, for example, in a forest harvesting situation, actually absorb and sequester more carbon than older trees. Little known fact is that particularly here in Australia, eucalypt trees, when they get to a certain age, they become what's called senescent. So when they get old, they actually start to decay. They actually start to emit carbon. So young regrowth trees after a forest harvesting operation actually absorb and sequester more carbon. That'll probably do. Thank you, Cam and Charlie. I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Matt. That was fantastic. All right. We'll just jump on. Charlie, do you want to come in so that people can see you when you're talking? Stage right. Enter stage right. Thanks, Matt and Charlie. That was fantastic. We've got sort of 10 to 15 minutes, so let's make the most of it. So any questions, please put them into the side there. I think what we might do is just kick off with Charlie. Charlie, you're leading the timber supply chain work here at Source Certain. I'm keen to kind of explore what you're seeing out and about. This all happens in the real world, like we are buying these products. How important is origin technology to sorting out, some of the technology, some of the challenges that you're seeing, and what can you see coming towards us?
Oh, that's a really good question. So
Lots of questions.
First thing I'm going to say is whatever I see and hear is almost certainly a very biased view and not necessarily a day-to-day reality for everybody. Normally, people would get in touch with somebody like me when they go, okay, I see something fishy. My view is not going to be the day-to-day view with respect to timber, but it's not uncommon to see issues where people say, okay, well, I've got a material, it's said to come from a particular place. For reasons that I can think of, it shouldn't be coming from that place, and it makes sense that it comes from a much riskier place. Could you take a look at the product and be able to check that out for us? And so, yeah, that's exactly what we do. We try and figure out ways to be able to do that and build the best kind of evidence if there's going to need to be a discussion with the supplier, because that can be one of the most challenging things that happens. You know that something isn't quite right with your supply. You want to do some due diligence, but finding the evidence to have a upfront discussion with the supplier, sometimes it requires some hard evidence, and sometimes that comes from people like us.
Yeah, I think a comment from me is there's a ubiquitous kind of, nature to some of these products too, right? And so some of these wood products are quite, they're everywhere, and we use them every day. And kind of what these sort of regulations do, but also the work you're doing and the work we get asked to do from a surveillance perspective is stuff that we were using every day. We didn't even know, like, there were problems there, right? And I think that's kind of my overarching comment is, till you go and have a look, you just do not know.
Yep, and sometimes looking can lead to more looking. You look at something and you go, hang on, we thought we were going to find this, and actually we found out this, that, and the other. And you can generally use that to lever change for positive reasons in the supply chain.
Yeah.
And this is why I think it's important that it's done as part of due diligence. So it's constructive.
Matt, I just want to build on your presentation. So I've been doing this work long enough to have seen kind of sort of trends. It sort of almost swings and roundabouts, in terms of the value of certification. So, I have quite a long history in certainly sort of fisheries and fishery management and certainly sustainably sourced fisheries. I mean, at a kind of summary level, I don't think there can be anything better, right, for certifications than these types of rules, because what it does, it makes it very, very relevant, but also defines it in a better sort of case. With all of this in mind, I'm kind of keen, what is the value in the context of EUDR, but also more generally from a consumer of certification? Headline question, why should people, one, look for it on the consumer end, and why do it?
Yeah, thanks, Cam. It's a really good question. So, if you don't mind, I might just sort of touch on a bit of that question you asked.
Go
Charlie before as well. So obviously, no, that's okay. So obviously, deforestation, it's such a crucial matter that the response is really needed on multiple levels, and these actually do include technology. So under the EU, they've actually introduced new deforestation regulations where a supplier must provide geolocation data, for example, for the wood product that they supply. So under this, I understand that the EU intends to use satellite monitoring to verify the supplier's deforestation-free claims. So look, I think that's a really great initiative, but as you know, like all technological solutions, there's bound to be limitations. And it's been touched on a bit before. I think Charlie just talked a bit about it. Limitations include, such as the fact that suppliers simply make false claims of origin. There might also be funding limitations for some of the EU regulators as well, and also there's obviously the capacity of small landholders, particularly in developing countries, to engage in complex technological process, any sort of complex technological process. There's also product diversion as well. So products are simply sent to another country with less regulation. I suppose one of the great benefits of forest certification, as I described it, didn't go into a huge amount of detail in this regard, but is that it's actually ground truth. So auditors go on site to the forest and they actually check the practices on the ground. So not only do they confirm that deforestation is not taking place, but they also audit, as I described before, also audit close to 200 additional sustainability criteria. So it's not just a double check, it actually goes way over and above the legislative and the regulatory requirements. So it's actually I think that's much more effective, for example, much more effective process for monitoring, as opposed to by satellites, for example, from a distance of maybe 500 kilometres. But can I just respond to the other question there too, if you like, Cam, just quickly? So yeah, look, there's obviously there's multiple tools are required as far as to respond to deforestation, and regulation, I guess, is just one tool in the tool bag. And I guess the reality is that in some countries, law enforcement agencies, they lack the financial resources and sometimes the legislative ability to adequately combat deforestation. So that's where a market-based approach and certification is absolutely a voluntary market-based approach can sometimes be more effective. And that really provides both the carrot and the stick. So the carrot being improved access to premium markets and also the third-party endorsement of first-class sustainability practices, and the stick being market exclusion and also reputation brand damage as well. I hope that answers.
No, yeah, it definitely does. It definitely does, Matt. I'm kind of keen to unpack a little bit of that because I think what from an observation perspective, obviously, again, looking at cross-sector in particular, but also having spent a lot of my career from an enforcement kind of endpoint, when you see regulatory transparency measures like this, I think what it does is enhances the I guess the market penetration of these types of communication things, and the bit that I genuinely support market-based solutions. I do believe they're the way, because supply chain by supply chain, I genuinely believe we can have impact. But I think what these regulatory interventions do is it not just amplifies, but it also draws some lines around, what the fair marketplace needs to be too, because there's one thing to invest in certification, like these things aren't free, right? And there's one of the questions we've got is around who should bear the cost, and the cost it's multi-dimensional, right? It's not just about certification; it's all the way across the supply chain, and so one of the things that I like about the regulation is it starts to make fairer those that have actually made investments and are actually trying to do the right thing and are attempting to do to actually have the impact that they like. And so, yeah, I'm interested to know from a responsible wood perspective, is this something you guys are talking about, that actually, cleaning up the marketplace is a good thing for you guys?
Yeah, and look, I should have probably emphasised too, Cam, that PFC is working very closely with the EUDR as well. And
Sure.
So we're actually, I guess, working in partnership with them to ensure that we can implement the EUDR. And look, in a lot of ways, so responsible wood, for example, in a lot of ways, our current standard for sustainable forest management actually goes over and above the EUDR proposal, for example. So, for example, in under the EUDR, I think they've got a 2020 conversion. So a conversion of that's basically converting a forest having been converted into a plantation before 2020, whereas responsible wood has we've actually got that set at 2007. So we're actually a bit stricter on that one as opposed to the EUDR as well. So yeah, no, look, absolutely, and as I said before, that's absolutely part of certification, is to ensure that the forest manager and the chain of custody certificate holder are complying with the legislation and the regulations that are in place. But certification just goes over and above that as well.
There's so much to talk about. I want to sort of deal with one of the ones that's in the chat here, and then I want to come back to your misinformation, because I want to talk about the stuff that, the hard stuff as well. I just want to, because someone kind of upvoted it, just this comment around the cost of EUDR. And so that's not an easy thing to answer. And, the certification, so, whether you're getting a certification, whether you're doing within supply chain, or whether you're doing kind of end product kind of testing. And, from our point of view, we're active right through the supply chain too. So it's not even just kind of there. And so the short answer is that there is definitely going to be a cost. Who ends up bearing it it's too early to know, other than what effectively the EUDR does is it says if you want to access the e-market, you have to do it, right? And so you've got to put together kind of something. And so the people that want to sell it have the requirement for the cost. What will then happen is, in the process of executing the due diligence, there'll be a whole heap of requirements by suppliers and other stakeholders, including forests down the other end, if it's a timber product, to support due diligence, which may require investment. And so I apologise a bit for the non-answer, but we're a little bit early in terms of how the economics is going to play out. Okay, Last sort of question, Matt. I want to come back to your misinformation. I really like your when you see responsible wood or PEFC, it's a commitment, right? That if it's a forest, basically if the product has come from there, it's still a forest, right? I really like the simplicity of that description.
Yeah.
There is obviously a lot of talk about the banning of logging inside native forests and effectively a discounting of the concept, and I'll be blunt, discounting the concept of sustainable forest management inside those forestry sort of units. I have two questions. I'm interested in a comment on that in terms of obviously your take, but I also want to know, I want to ask the question, what are the unintended consequences here of doing it, right? And my subtext to that is this timber's got to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give a bit of an overview of the Australian context, and I didn't have time to show all of my slides, but I have some slides that I tend to show, just demonstrating that. So Australia's forest. So Australia's actually the sixth most forested country in the world. We've got about 134 million hectares of forest, and the vast majority of that is native forest. So we've actually got about 132 million hectares of forest, and that's the forest that you're talking about, Cam. So Australia's forests have actually been actively and adaptively managed for about 60,000 plus years by Australia's traditional owners. So it's well documented, it's not disputed that Australia's traditional owners actually use fire as a friend, not as a foe in the management of our forests. So what they did was they introduced fire into the forested landscape. They do that intentionally because they wanted to clear sections of the forest, and by clearing sections of the forest, that would allow for grasses to grow where there once were trees, and then that would encourage large animals like kangaroos to come in. And that was actually known as one of the earliest forms of agriculture, known as fire stick farming. So there's a book written by a gentleman by the name of Bill Gamage. So it's basically titled "How the Biggest Estate on Earth: How Aborigines Made Australia." So I'd encourage people to read that book. So what I'm getting to here is that native forest, so certified native forest harvesting in Australia actually replicates what our traditional owners have done for 60,000 plus years. So trees are removed, for example, and a certain amount of trees need to be retained by law. So there's very strict legislation and regulations and codes of practice that underpin the way that forestry is practiced in Australia. And once those trees are removed, a light burn is introduced into the forest generally, and the light burn actually creates what we call a mineral ash seed bed. And that allows, and then the smoke from that burn usually induces seed fall in the eucalypt seed pods, and the trees actually regrow and regenerate naturally. So it actually replicates a natural process, as I said, which has been done for 60,000 plus years. So unfortunately, some of the forests have actually, so Victoria, the Victorian publicly managed state forests, and also the Western Australian public native forests. So commercial native forest harvesting in those states has unfortunately ceased. So as of 1 January this year, which is what you're talking about. I'm not going to go into the political aspects of that, Cam, but no. all that I can say is that so Responsible Wood, we do certify native forest operations in Australia. And the Responsible Wood standard is based on science and best practice management. So, as I said, it's absolutely not based on deforestation. So what that's going to mean now, unfortunately, so hardwood from those forests is now going to have to be imported from overseas. And at the moment, Australia has a trade deficit of approaching $5 billion in forest and wood-based products. So we're now going to have to import more hardwood, for example, from other countries that may not have as sustainable forest management practices as we do here in Australia. So that's implications for us here in Australia. So we're actually as I said, we have a trade deficit of about $5 billion, and that's now just going to increase. And there's also all the as I said earlier, all the climate mitigation benefits from sustainable harvesting of our forests. And just to put it into context too, so roughly each year, it's going to be a lot less now because obviously in Victoria and Western Australia, those commercial publicly managed forests have shut down. Each year, about 0.06% of Australia's native forests are harvested on those publicly managed lands. So that's like taking out, say, if you have 10,000 trees in a forest, that's like taking out 6 trees out of a forest. So the real threat to native animals and the real threat to flora and fauna in Australia are a whole bunch of other things like feral animals, deforestation, such as urban expansion and clearing forest for infrastructure development. So there's a lot of science out there as well, Cam, a lot of science that supports sustainable forest management that's done through certified schemes such as Responsible Wood. But there's also science as well that tells a different story. So that's just the way it is, unfortunately. But yeah, as I said before, the Responsible Wood certification scheme is absolutely based on science and best practice management, and it's not ideologically based.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think it's a good spot to sort of wrap up. I guess I'll make kind of a final comment that I don't think anybody necessarily can disagree with the need to manage these sorts of resources carefully, given, you know, the headline objective of EUDR is to stop deforestation. You know, my overarching comment here is that we're moving into a period where we need more products that are more sustainable and ideally store carbon, not necessarily use them. And I look at the world through kind of a supply chain lens, and again, around supply and demand, there's immense amounts of demand. What the EUDR is looking to do is to say, we're going to use the demand to achieve a particular outcome with respect to, you know, impact against, you know, deforestation. You know, that type of theory and concept, I think, flows across all of these types of issues, which is, you know, more transparency, you know, more science. All of these things are necessary to navigate these types of issues. And like you, I don't want to get into the politics, but again, it's not just about the first decision; it's the second decision and the third decision. It's those unintended consequences, which is, you know, where do those things come from? And effectively, you know, you put the due diligence, you know, onto another company, which then, you know, effectively we're out of sight, out of mind, which is kind of how the EU got to where they've got to, right, in terms of that new regulation. So thank you very much. It was a great spot to end. I quite like the kind of meaty parts of the conversation. So, all right, that wraps us up. I'd just like to thank Matt very much for your time today and also the contribution. Fantastic presentation and great contribution to the panel. Thanks also to Charlie. Thank you to everybody for taking the time late in the day or early in the day, depending on where you are in the world, to attend the webinar. We will be sharing the presentations as well as the actual video, I think, with all of the people that have signed up. Please take a little bit of time to share some feedback with us. This is only our second one of these. We're really keen to keep doing them. So tell us what you like, tell us what you don't like. Like I said, we will share as much of the information as we can in follow-ups. Please also take some time to go and connect with us online. So we have a newsletter that you can sign up for on our website. Please also follow our social media channels, specifically LinkedIn. You can also find all of the panelists, myself included, on LinkedIn. Please connect. I look forward to sharing some more of our content. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a fantastic evening or day ahead of you. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you all. Thanks, Cam. Thanks, Charlie.